Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a piece called Considering Decadence and the Intellectuals by Douthat. Recently, he put out a piece where he was talking about how there seems to be a kind of decline of intellectuals. He starts off wondering if there are any great writers anymore, if the great novel is going down. He thinks Toni Morrison was the last great novelist. It really poses the question of if we're losing the great novelist, if we don't have the novelist around anymore. There's reasons for him to become bullish about it by the end. And I really like this sort of idea of asking ourselves the question, would I be educated if I never experienced X? And he really defines a great novelist as someone of whom you couldn't consider yourself educated to have not read. And when you ask yourself that, it's like, oh man, who have I read that if I didn't read, I couldn't consider myself educated? I think that's a nice heuristic. That's a nice question to ask, because you could apply it to a lot of things. Like, which movies, had I not seen, would something be missing from my life that would just be awful? Which shows, which paintings, which pieces of music? Would I understand the world and myself without why? I think that's a great question, and in a way I try to frame it to try to help us determine the greats in every field, whether it be spoken word, jazz, novels, whatever. Kind of asking yourself the question, who does it terrify me to think I could have never encountered and never known who I missed? Who is it that if you never encountered, that just the thought of never encountering and then not realizing you never encountered them is kind of a horrifying thought? And that may help you determine who is a great thinker or deserves to be one of the great thinkers, at least in your own life. He makes this quote from Oswald and Tainer, where he makes this point where he says, Tolstoy was only 4 years dead when Spengler started his book. Marx was only 30 years deceased. But Spengler could state with the full expectation that his audience would not question him, that these men belonged in global pantheon of humanity's greatest figures. And Rawls asks, the question is asked, is there anyone who died in the last decade you could make that sort of claim for? He brings up Cormac McCarthy for writers, and I think you could also maybe say like a John Asbury or Lewis Gluck, at least if we're just referring to America. And so there have been some greats, but the point stands. And I think what gets me into the interesting topic now is where he goes through kind of saying there's hope for the novel, but then he asks, what about great thinkers, like great intellectuals? And he goes, well, it's hard to think of any. And he doesn't think Jordan Peterson, he doesn't think Zizek, people like that are going to be read. If there's a great books canon in 2075, he doesn't think they're going to be on it, that it's difficult to be sure of that. Now, that's not to say he doesn't think people like Peterson or Zizek, Butler, etc. don't have important things to say and don't matter. But he's really asking the question, is there anyone still alive or who died within the last decade who you can imagine people still reading in 2075? And he's not so sure. And so then the question becomes, why is that? Why has there perhaps been a decline in the quality of intellectuals? What has gone down? One thing he brings up is he thinks there's been a decline of the dialectic, you could say, between tradition and the new, progressivism, the old and the new, that we've thrown out the old too much. And he really views that new ideas are often generated through a dialectical process between the old and the new. So if you go too far in the direction of tradition, you lose greatness, and if you go too far in the direction of newness, you lose greatness. So the piece I wrote is going to argue that there, to try to come up with 4 more reasons why if indeed the intellectualism is in decline, or we don't have any great intellectuals anymore, then here are 4 reasons why we may not. One could be that Derrida generally halted, if not ended, the ancient quest for the great system. This is not to say Derrida and deconstruction disproved great systems like a Marx or Hegel. This is not to say that there aren't still systematic things like government or church. But generally speaking, philosophy has moved away from system building. We don't get someone coming out with something like the Critique of Pure Reason, or Hegel's the philosophy, the phenomenology of mind. We don't see that so much. We don't see these great projects. A lot of the philosophers today are more in the direction of thought experiments, essays on topics, or frankly, the majority of what you see is classes on the history of philosophy, an analysis of previous thinkers. We have scholars on Derrida, scholars on Hegel, but not so much people trying to write their own new philosophy. And there's some legitimacy to this. I mean, I think Whitehead once said he was skeptical of long chains of deductions, and I myself can find systems problematic. And also, I think Derrida makes good points that systems, kind of following Foucault, can be used to oppress, to facilitate, to cement old trains of thought, and to keep them from being attacked by criticism. And they can be used to establish a system of what is right and what is wrong that can marginalize and oppress. And so there's reason to be skeptical of system building. But at the same time, one of the reasons you don't hesitate to say Hegel was a great thinker, even though you may think he's crazy, is because he built a vast system. The same with Marx. And the thing about systems is there's always something new to find. They're so big. You can always go back. There's always reason to reinterpret them, to interpret them anew, to find something new. And so they're constantly rereadable. Whereas books and philosophies that are not systems are not as rereadable. And one of the reasons we may be reading someone like Hegel as of 2075 is precisely because there's so much space for new interpretation and to find new gems that were lost before. I mean, there's a movement right now to re-understand Hegel in light of psychoanalysis as a thinker that is very Freudian before Freud. And so he has a whole new role to play as opposed to simply being the person that leads to Marx. And, so after Derrida, and really who pulls apart efforts to create systems and makes us question them, there's not as much of a willingness to build systems, and so people don't do it. And there's, and maybe for good, it's not all bad that this has happened, but there's a lovely part in that very important book, I think, 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, where there's this scene where a pharmacist, the narrator asks a pharmacist what books he liked and what books he was reading, and the pharmacist answers with some sort of short stories. And this depresses the protagonist, and he thinks, to quote, "Now even bookish pharmacists are afraid to take on the great, imperfect, torrential works, books that blaze paths into the unknown. They choose the perfect exercise of the great masters, or what amounts to the same thing. They watch the great masters spar, but they have no interest in real combat. When the great masters struggle against that something that terrifies us all, that's something that cows us and spurs us on amid blood and mortal wounds and stench." That's a great passage. So the idea there is that people aren't interested in the great novels anymore, just short stories. And I think something similar can be said that after Derrida, we're really not interested in systems. We're more interested in essays and small works about classical thinkers and very topical as opposed to systems thinking. Now again, to move against systems is not all bad. There can be the problem of monotheism, as we discuss, which is we discuss in another paper, which is the idea of seeing the entire world through a single lens. Likewise, there can be a problem with seeing the world through an entire system. But at the same time, there's some validity to the effort to try to make expansive works that explain a lot. And there's certainly something to be said about trying to make one's own body of thought that is internally consistent. So again, this Derrida has given us some food for thought, but it might be a reason why it's hard to imagine a great thinker today. The second reason, and this is going to be based on a paper I did called Austin Farah and the Problem of Verifiable Education. The second issue is that to be considered educated and permitted by institutions to pursue projects, what we think and create often must be verifiable, which is difficult and limits the range of topics that can be explored. And what I mean by that is, I'll just read this little section, in which often college students today are asked to refine their reactions to thinkers, to iron out or explain the theology of Barth, for example, as opposed to explain Barth in order to point to what he, Dante, Aquinas, Murdoch, and others climbed toward, what they were on. What I mean by this is that graduate students and professors are incentivized to become experts in the thinking of some great mind, Smith, Marx, Hume. And though there's certainly value in being mentored, even Aquinas started out by working diligently on the sentences of Lombard. But that's not all Aquinas did. So, again, to read from the paper, when Karl Barth wrote, there was no Barth system against which his writing could be verified and approved of. His ideas had to be read on their own terms and considered in light of their own intelligibility and depth, not to the degree his writing could be judged and verified as accurately representing and understanding Karl Barth. For Karl Barth to write was for Karl Barth to stumble ahead with only a vague sense of where his fingertips led him and no possibility of verifying what he headed that he headed in any constructive direction at all. If graduate students are held to this standard, they will have no choice but to only pursue that which could be verified against a pre-existing system, which isn't to say this is a bad practice, but to suggest it shouldn't be the only game in town. If it is, there's no telling how many Barts we might miss out on. Well, I'm not going to read the whole paper here, but the idea is that generally institutions incentivize somebody to do work on a prior thinker, because then that work can be verified in light of that thinker, and we can, we can determine if you got Barth right because we can compare you with Barth. So we want people to pursue projects we can verify. But that means we don't really want people pursuing topics like the beatific vision, or pursuing topics of what is grace, like these pursuits, which is ironic because that's kind of what got people like Barth or Aquinas or Balthasar to do their work, is they wanted to understand the world. But there was no pre-existing system which their ideas could be compared against. They could be debated on terms of, does it match with the internal consistency of God's person or with the Bible or what we know from Christian tradition? But it could not be compared against the system of a thinker themselves. It's hard to imagine anyone being a great and original thinker if practically the only way to get our thinking validated against today is against pre-existing systems. If it's a case where you're not going to get tenure somewhere, or you're not going to get your papers published unless you are doing papers about the work of, say, Karl Barth, as opposed to doing your own work, well, then all the incentives are to fall in line with education that can be validated. And there's a Schopenhauer quote about a ladder that I really like. You should check the paper out for more detail on it. So anyway, we are incentivized to become scholars of thinkers, as opposed to pursuers of a truth, a beauty, a goodness, or so on. And this in of itself may get in the way of great thinkers, of why we don't have as many great thinkers, because it's hard to imagine someone becoming one of the great thinkers that we read, 75 years from now, who was simply an expert in another person's thinker. I guess you could argue that Plato does that with Socrates, but the lines blur there, right? And again, I'm not saying there's nothing to be said about mentorship from studying a classical thinker, but there is something to be said to moving on to doing your own work. And it's almost like that's always the plan. That's always what's intended by institutions. But it's almost, I think, perhaps, that after years of being habituated to being an expert in another thinker, it becomes very difficult to go and then do your own work, because you've been so habituated to being a scholar of, as opposed to a thinker who is after something. The third reason we may not have as many great thinkers today is because big ideas could be seen as cementing systems of power, and so are avoided. And there's truth to this. I mean, Foucault went through history and showed how ideas of the normal, ideas of how the world works can be used to oppress people. That ideas of God's person can be used to justify a war against the Catholics, or a war against the Muslims, or a war against the Hindus, or all these terrible things, religious wars that have happened in history. So big ideas can be used to oppress and to justify terrible violence. At the same time, we can't get through life without an idea of what we think constitutes justice. We can't get through life without an idea of what we think constitutes freedom. So we're going to have big ideas. We can't simply say that they can be used to oppress people. Therefore, we're not going to have big ideas, because you're still going to have them. And if you don't take the time to own them, you're going to do so in a manner that's kind of random, that's not very put together. And that in of itself could lead to violence. Because if you have big ideas, and big ideas can be the cause of problems in the world, well, if you don't have big ideas then they're probably going to be used. They may end up being used in ways that are harmful. In the same way that if you don't know how to handle fire, well, you still need fire to cook. You still need fire to do things in society. And if you don't use it because you're like, well, it can burn down villages, it can hurt people, then there's going to be a lot of good that you miss out on. So big ideas are unavoidable, but we tend to be very skeptical, sort of have a cynicism toward anyone that pursues big ideas, that tries to write works of big ideas. We also kind of go, who are you to think that you can answer these questions? So there can be social stigma against pursuing big questions. There also can be, if we're talking an institutional setting, precisely because you're aware that people can view the big ideas as sources of oppression, you may not be as incentivized to pursue them. But of course, a lot of the reason why a lot of the great thinkers of history are the great thinkers of history is because they helped us pursue big ideas. And so if that's off the table now in fears of oppression, well, that could be a problem. That's going to contribute to why we don't have as many great thinkers today. The fourth reason, the last one here, is that technology is often viewed as having won the debate over ideas on what makes the world a better place. And Dietrich Maclowski does really good work to argue that the Great Enrichment, which is where the average person on the planet's quality of life skyrocketed suddenly, somewhere after the 1800s. And she says that the reason for that is wasn't because of technology, but because of ideas. And I really encourage you to pursue Dietrich Maclowski's project. Look her up on YouTube. But a lot of people today really don't think ideas matter. They don't think philosophy gets you anywhere. They don't think it has a practical consequence. They don't think that pursuing the big questions is going to make a difference. It certainly won't get you a job. And you're probably not going to get any good answers because, who do you think you are to pursue these topics if Plato and Aristotle couldn't figure it out or only could start the conversation? So we don't really believe that these things matter. What we believe is that the world is made better because of technology. Because look what computers do for us. Look what, planes, automobiles, all these things. It seems like technology is what makes the world a better place. We don't really believe ideas do. Now, of course, you can't invent the computer unless you have an idea. So there are some ideas we accept, but those tend to be the technological ideas, the business ideas, the entrepreneurial ideas. But ideas like philosophical and theological ideas, well, we make space in society for academics to do those things, but we really think it's impractical and a waste of time to not do that, unless you're a professor, and then it's okay because, you're getting a paycheck. It's your job, so it's okay to pursue those ideas. So we've really lost faith that ideas make a difference. And of course, this is really ironic because if Dietrich Maclowski is correct, then it's precisely ideas, and really philosophical ideas, because, she's going to talk about the idea of freedom and the idea that work has dignity, both of which are philosophical, being key to the explosion of technological progress that follows. So those are philosophical ideas. So if we don't believe that those are practical anymore, well, then we're not going to pursue them. And then, of course, we're not going to have as many great thinkers. We're going to have a lot of great entrepreneurs, but we're not going to have as many great thinkers. So anyway, those are the four reasons that I give. I'm not saying that's all of them. There easily could be more. The paper's going to close with, if I'm going to be so bold that if we do have any more great thinkers, I do think they're going to come out of the realm of aesthetics. I think aesthetics is an underappreciated field. I think it's also where we can find some answers on questions of belonging and purpose that we are lacking in the world of pluralism today, that we feel like we're lacking. I also think there are great thinkers like Balthasar that are not explored. So if institutions forced you to explore them, you would still come up with new ideas. And I think aesthetics also, when you ask questions like what is beautiful, you can't help but get into questions of what is true and good. Whereas if you ask what is good, you may not get into questions of beautiful or true. And if you get into questions of true, you may get into questions of goodness, but not beauty. So there's something all-encompassing about beauty. And I think there's a lot to be found in beauty that is not fully appreciated. So anyway, this is OG Rose. Thank you for your time. For more, please visit ogrose.com. You can find us on YouTube. Like, subscribe. It always helps. And thank you for your time.